The more you know someone, then the more you love them. The more you get to know that person, their likes, their dislikes, their character traits, their plus points, their negative points, and so on, then the more you love them. And it's exactly the same with God. The more you get to know God, know more of Him, know more about Him, then the more you love Him. And that's really why we're doing this little set of clips or studies on the names of God. One of the ways we can get to know God is obviously through getting to know what He is like. And one of the ways that we get to know what He is like is by thinking about the various names that are ascribed to Him in our Bibles. Whenever you're reading the Bible, often you'll just see the term Lord in capitals, especially in the Old Testament. The term Lord. And really, that term there, it is Jehovah, but often it's Jehovah, but sometimes it can be Jehovah Jireh, sometimes it can be Jehovah Shammah, and so on. But just in our English Bible, it appears as Lord. And really, what we want to do in these next few weeks is just go through the various names of God and trust that as we learn something more about God, as we get to know more about Him, and then the more we will be enabled to love Him during COVID-19. In the famous play Romeo and Juliet, Juliet asks Romeo, what's in a name? She was challenging him really about the importance of his last name, his family name. What's in a name, Romeo? And when we think about the names of God, and particularly this name, the name Jehovah, and we ask it the question, what's in a name? Well, this name Jehovah, it certainly packs a large punch. The name Jehovah is one of the most frequently used in the Bible. It's actually used some 6,000 times, over 6,000 times. And whenever the copyists of the manuscripts were copying out our Bible, as they would come to the name Jehovah, they would treat it with such reverence that they actually wouldn't even speak the name out loud. And every time they wrote the name down, they actually would change their clothes as well. Such was their reverence for the name Jehovah, the name of God. As I've said, there's an awful lot in this name. And I just want to draw some thoughts about the name Jehovah as we find it in the Bible and find how it is used in the Bible. And I trust that as we get to know more about this name and the other names of God, as I've said, we will know God more and then be enabled by His grace to love Him more. When we think about the name Jehovah, the first thing that it shows us about God is that God is everlasting. He's everlasting. In Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, you read of this name being used for the first time, where we read of the Lord creating the heaven and the earth. And the thought there is of God always existing. He is existing even way before this world, the earth, the heavens, and so on were created. Again in Genesis chapter 21, you read of Abraham, and he's making a covenant, a promise, something that will last forever with a man named Ahimelech. And in verse 33, after making that covenant, that binding promise, that binding obligation, you read in that verse 33, that Abraham, he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Again, the term Lord there, it is Jehovah. And it's qualified by the everlasting God. Again, showing that God, He is everlasting. He's always existed, and He always will exist. You and I, we haven't always existed. We always will exist in some way, shape, or form, in terms of our souls and our bodies. But we haven't always existed. And yet God, when we think about God, He has always existed and He is everlasting. When we think about that truth, especially at such a time as COVID-19, it's good to remember that God's everlasting, because we live very much for the present. We are at times very absorbed with our own problems, our own trials, everything that's going on, and especially at a time like this. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's good to remember that the one whom we trust, the one whom we serve, God, He is everlasting. He has always existed, and He always will exist. And He is working out His purposes, His eternal, everlasting purposes for your life, individually, specifically, and also then for this world. Generally, God has an eternal purpose for this world, and COVID-19 is part of that purpose and plan. So it's good to remember that all of these things are part of the purpose and plan of a God who always exists and always will exist. So the name Jehovah teaches us that God's everlasting, but it also teaches us that God is self-existing. He's self-existing. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14, God comes to Moses and God speaks to Moses, and He states there, I am that I am. I am that I am. What He's really saying there to Moses is this. He is saying that He is the only self-sufficient being. We like to think of ourselves as self-sufficient, but if we've learned one thing over these last few weeks during COVID-19, it's that none of us are really self-sufficient, if we're honest with ourselves. We depend upon the NHS, we depend upon Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, whoever it is, for shopping, different shops, SuperValu, all of those shops. We depend upon them for our daily lives. Even the farmers and so on. We are so dependent upon others just to survive. And that is something that has been greatly highlighted during COVID-19. But when we think about God, God is really the only self-sufficient being when you think about it that way. He is self-existing. That means He doesn't depend upon us for His existence. But we very much depend upon Him for our existence. The Bible tells us that in Him, in God, we live, we move, and we have our being. All that we have is given to us by God, and all then that we have can be taken from God as well. Job spoke of that. The Lord gave, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And again, at such a time, it's good to remember that we serve and we are before one who is self-existing, one who owns everything, one who possesses all things, and one who certainly doesn't need us, though we very much need Him. We very much need Him. It's good to remember that, and especially those who are Christians watching on in this video. If we learn nothing else about COVID-19, we should learn to trust Him more. The psalmist speaks it, trusting the Lord at all times. Again in Psalm 11 verse 1, as it comes to mind, I read this recently in my daily devotions. In the Lord put I my trust. And how say ye to my soul, flee as a bird to the mountain? In the Lord put I my trust. David, he was facing a trial, a difficulty, and yet he placed his faith and trust in a God who was unchanging and self-existing. So let's never forget that we depend upon God for so much, It's good again to cast ourselves upon the one who has promised to supply all of our needs, one who is self-existing. So God, He is everlasting, He is self-existing. But God, when we think about Him being Jehovah, it also shows us that He is unchanging. In Psalm 90, we read in verse 2, from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. And the thought there is of God, yes, he's everlasting, He always has been, He always will be, but He hasn't changed throughout time. Again in verse 4 of Psalm 90, we read, for 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday. As yesterday. Things change, and they are changing so rapidly, aren't they? With the passing of the hour, more news breaks, more information is gathered, it is distributed. Things are changing very, very rapidly. Every single day things are changing. And yet in an ever-changing world, we belong to and we serve an unchanging God. One who, even with the passing of 1,000 years, He doesn't change. It's good to remember that, child of God. that whilst we face these ever-changing circumstances in life, we are surrounded by, we are supported by, and we are joined to, through Jesus Christ, we are joined to one who is unchanging, the one who is the same yesterday, as Hebrews 13 tells us, and today, and forever. So I trust that at such a time like this, that you're encouraged, that you're strengthened, as you think about God being Jehovah, as you think about him being unchanging, one who is self-sufficient or self-existing, and one who is everlasting. And that this enables you just to trust him that little bit more this week.